Continuing now with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's The Final Days. In our last session, we came to the end of Monday, August 5th, and so we're now moving into Tuesday, August 6th, 1974. Back at his desk on Tuesday morning, Haig called those members of the cabinet who still had not been informed of the meeting. It was perhaps the least of his priorities. Today, Haig had to cope with the Hill and the Nixon family. With events closing in, Haig was aware that he could easily get mousetrapped. A basic element of the scenario seemed to be failing. Each time the president heard that somebody on the Hill was calling for his resignation, he became more resolved to fight to the finish. His tirades were always the same. He would not be forced out by some legislative coup. If they wanted him out of office, let them vote to impeach and convict. Nixon was still not certain that he would lose in the Senate. Haig and Bazard had discussed the problem again last night. They agreed that it was crucial that no more Republican leaders call for the president's resignation. At the same time, the leaders had to make clear to Nixon that they regarded his impeachment and conviction as a foregone conclusion. Then Nixon might begin to see that resignation was the most attractive way out. He had to come to the conclusion himself. He had to perceive it as his own decision. Haig was perplexed about the family. He had been left with a strong impression that at least David saw the wisdom of resignation. But the president was describing the family as united behind his decision to fight on. Haig called David and asked what the hell was going on. David, still confident that the president would come around, suggested that Haig stay cool. The staff was ignoring too many human factors, he said. Haig and others were focusing narrowly on the legal implications and the incriminating evidence, and not considering how the president might react to his situation. If the family were not supportive, it could make it tougher for the president to resign. We have to show him that he doesn't have to prove anything to us, David said. Any encouragement to resign on their part would imply a devastating moral judgment. He thought that his father-in-law was resisting that moral judgment more than resignation. The family had to show the president that they still loved him no matter what. Haig was skeptical of amateur psychologizing. Trust me, David said, I know what I'm doing. Mr. Nixon could accept political defeat, but he would not allow himself to be condemned morally. At 9 a.m., the strategy group assembled, battered and dispirited. Most of the group, among them Bazart, Timmons, Buchanan, and Gergen, were ready to fold up operations. Only Clausen and Kachigian seemed anxious to fight, and they had scarcely an idea on how to proceed. This morning was different from others that had followed damaging Watergate disclosures. There was no organized propaganda campaign. There were no statements, no background briefings, and few meetings. At 10 a.m., St. Clair met with his assistants at McCahill's suggestion. St. Clair didn't particularly like meetings. He ran them tightly, never allowing the discussion to range over matters that were not immediately at hand. He reacted to his staff cagily, just as he did to outsiders. This morning there was a hint of exasperation and surliness in his voice. As he entered the room, he noticed that one of his assistants, Lauren Smith, who suffered from a bronchial condition, was wearing an asthma mask. What's your problem? St. Clair snapped at him. The purpose of the meeting, St. Clair announced, was to tell everyone that the president's plan was to go to trial in the Senate. Everything was to be business as usual. As for the new evidence, we're going to deal with it like any other problem, St. Clair said. His intention was to find a technical defense. There was no proof whatsoever, he pointed out, that the president knew of the entire cover-up. The same distinction was being made by some of the more militant presidential defenders. There was a little cover-up, the move to slow the FBI probe by using the CIA. And there was the big cover-up, the organized clandestine payment of money to the original Watergate defendants. An argument could be made that the president was only a part of the little cover-up. The president wants to go to trial, St. Clair repeated. As lawyers for the president, they had work to do. The staff filed dutifully out of the office. The cabinet meeting, scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning, had been postponed to 11 because the president was not up at 10. On the hour, Nixon walked into the room and took his seat at the center of the oval table. There wasn't the usual applause. The president's high-backed brown leather chair was slightly taller than the others. Directly in front of him, under the lip of the table which he had donated to the White House, there were two spaces for buttons. One button had summoned Haldeman. The other had been Mark Butterfield and had activated the taping system in the cabinet room. Now both Haldeman and the taping system were gone. Kissinger was on Nixon's right, Secretary of Defense Schlesinger at his left. Ford was facing the president across the table and slightly to the left. Steward served coffee. "I would like to discuss the most important issue confronting this nation," the president began, "and confronting us internationally, too. Inflation." Cabinet members looked about in mild astonishment. But Nixon quickly shifted to what was on everybody's mind. "I want the facts out," he said. He described Watergate as one of the most asinine things that was ever done. "I'll take whatever lumps are involved." He had consulted expert lawyers, and they had told him that there was no obstruction of justice and no impeachable offense. "If there were," he said, "I wouldn't stay in this office 1 minute. I simply was not tending the store on the domestic side. Because the CIA and the FBI were at loggerheads, I sought to act. You all know I was concerned almost exclusively with national security interests, but I did mention certain political interests. The cabinet has been splendid in standing up. I've been very moved by it. Some, including some good friends, believe it would be best to resign and not go through the ordeal of a Senate trial. Not go through this step, which would relieve me of great personal pressure and change the Constitution, that would allow other presidents to be forced out of office. I've considered that, as a matter of fact. It should be considered, but I have had to make a decision. A president is really not in the position of an ordinary citizen on this kind of matter. My view is that I should not take the step that changes the Constitution and sets a precedent for the future. It would be the parliamentary system with all its weaknesses and none of its strengths, from my own standpoint and that of my family, something which I have had to consider. I will accept whatever verdict the Senate hands down, recognizing the possibility that the outcome may not be favorable." The president didn't look at anyone as he spoke. HUD Secretary Lynn was watching for a flicker of the eye or nervousness in the hand, some sign that the president was bluffing. He concluded that Nixon was going to fight, or else he was playing the best poker Lynn had ever seen. "I've analyzed the best I can," the president went on, "the best memory I can, buttressed by miles and miles of tape, and I have not found an impeachable offense, and therefore resignation is not an acceptable course. I don't ask any of you to do anything that would be embarrassing to you, your personal interest. All I ask is that you run this government well. I've vetoed $35 billion in appropriations during Watergate. I intend to fight this inflation battle with all the tools we can. It's not been a very easy year or week. I want to do the right thing for the country, for me too, but the other matter comes first. I have a very loyal, competent cabinet. If I resign, it would change the Constitution. Some of you may disagree, and I respect that. But I've made my decision. You don't have to talk about Watergate. I suggest that you talk about the good things the administration has done. Watergate will be brought to an end by the constitutional process. He would make all evidence available to the House. Although I could delay for a month, nothing will be withheld. I don't ask you to get involved in my problems, but it is time to do a bit extra in running the government. If I knew there was an impeachable offense, I would not make the Senate go through the agony of trying to prove it. I've got a hell of a good cabinet. I will go through this with my head high, right up to the end, if it comes." Treasury Secretary Simon, sitting across from the president to Ford's right, felt that the president was beseeching his cabinet to stand up and cheer, but it wasn't going to happen. The silence, Simon thought, was telling the president what he already knew. There would be no clamor that he stay on the job. The president turned to Ford and waited. "I'm in a difficult position," Ford said. "I share your view that the whole episode is a real tragedy. Nobody has more admiration and affection for you. I made a decision yesterday that because of commitments to Congress and the public, I will have no further comments on the issue because I am a party in interest." "Sure, there will be impeachment," Ford said, perhaps too frankly. "I can't predict the Senate outcome. I will make no comment concerning this. You have given us the finest foreign policy this country has ever had, a super job, and the people appreciate it. I support without hesitation your policies on inflation." "I think your position is exactly correct," the president responded, looking across the table at the vice president. To Ford, the meeting and the president's speech seemed off-key. He thought Nixon was handling the moment badly. "If you have to run for office again," the president said to Ford, "you're going to have to run your own campaign. I had very decent people, but it doesn't excuse their actions." Turning to the budget, the president repeated that there would be no sacred cows on cuts in spending. That discussion went on for about a half hour. Then the president turned to a forthcoming summit meeting on the economy. Attorney General Saxby, directly across from the president, interrupted. Mr. President, I don't think we ought to have a summit conference. We ought to be sure you have the ability to govern. The president replied quietly and condescendingly as if he were lecturing a schoolboy. Bill, I have the ability, just as I have had for the last 5 years. George Bush, sitting at the end of the table to the president's right, said he agreed with Saxby. The president's ability to govern was impaired. The president began to lecture him, but Kissinger intervened. He wanted to avoid any open disagreement. It is a difficult period for the country. We must show that it is a going concern. It is essential that we show it is not safe for any country to take a run at us, so we can vindicate the structure for peace. The president adjourned the meeting at 12:30 p.m. Large crowds were gathering outside the White House gates, and more than the usual number of reporters were waiting for the departing cabinet members. Simon was surrounded. The president sincerely believes he has not committed any impeachable offense, he said. He intends to stay. From outside the gates, voices shouted, "Tell us what happened! Tell us what happened!" Kissinger stayed behind when the meeting broke up and spoke briefly to the president. Then the secretary walked back to his office in the West Wing. There was precious little support for the president, he told General Scowcroft. Weak-livered was the way he characterized Attorney General Saxby. Saxby and George Bush have been petty and insensitive, Kissinger said. He compared the situation to a 17th century royal court with the courtiers scurrying about, concerned with themselves rather than their country. The cabinet meeting had depressed him. There was always the possibility that some foreign power would do something foolish. Barry Goldwater had driven to his office early. After having spent a brooding evening, he was angry. He blamed himself in part for the current nightmare. He should have pushed Nixon harder to be open and frank. His concern had been the office and the party, not Nixon, but he had been overly protective nonetheless. It had taken him too long to apply his stern, no-nonsense judgment. Christ, Goldwater was thinking, he had never really had a conversation with Nixon. He'd never gotten through to him. He would come in to discuss something. He would come in to discuss one thing, and damned if the president didn't act as if he hadn't heard it. Now Goldwater realized that he didn't even like the man. Nixon had an obsession with the outward signs of power, trumpets, dressing up the White House guards, ceremonies. To Goldwater, this was, in one of his favorite expressions, a bucket of shit. Goldwater thought Nixon was not a man's man, someone with whom he could drink or joke or have a frank heart-to-heart discussion. He was thinking of the contrast with John F. Kennedy. At a particularly tense moment during the Bay of Pigs invasion period, President Kennedy had said to him, "So you want this fucking job?" Goldwater now concluded that Nixon was off his head and had been for quite a while, and that he had probably known about the Watergate break-in in advance. Shortly after Goldwater arrived at his office, Bush called to tell him that an emergency cabinet meeting was scheduled. The senator was snappish. "I don't think the president can get 15 votes in the Senate," he told Bush, "and I'm not going to protect him anymore." Bush wasn't sure what to do next. Apparently Nixon was ready to bring even further ruin for himself and the party. "How can we impress upon the president the seriousness of this?" he asked Goldwater. The senator didn't have any answers, but he promised to stay in touch. Before the cabinet meeting, Bush spread the word of Goldwater's gloomy assessment to others, including Dean Birch. Goldwater was at a Senate Space Committee hearing on the Hill when he received a message to call Haig or Birch. Interrupting a witness to whom he had addressed a question, he apologized and went out to return the call. He reached Birch. "Between 13 and 17 Senate votes," Goldwater told him, refining his earlier estimate of 15. "And that is all. I have talked to enough people on the floor to know that he is lost." He asked Birch to pass the information on to Haig. Birch informed Haig at the end of the cabinet meeting. This was what Haig had needed. He planned to use it to help tip the scales, and it would not have to come out of his own mouth. The vice president had canceled a morning speech to attend the cabinet meeting. At 1:15 p.m., he headed for the Senate GOP policy luncheon. Senator Tower immediately asked him to report on the cabinet meeting. Ford tried to brush it over, saying that he had told the cabinet he would make no more comments and that the president had agreed. The balance of the cabinet meeting dealt with the economy, Ford said. The usually placid lunch erupted. The senators wanted more detail on the earlier part of the cabinet meeting. The president said that he was not guilty of an impeachable offense, Ford replied. He conceded that the House battle was lost and that the Senate would make the final decision. The cabinet members did not speak much. George Bush did speak out and noted that the situation in the House was serious. What else did George say? Goldwater asked, wondering to himself if Bush was peddling a different line to the cabinet than he had peddled to Goldwater that morning. He just generally spoke of the deteriorating situation in the House, Ford answered. Well, that bothers us a great deal, Goldwater said. He exploded. The House Judiciary Republicans and John Rhodes realize that the situation is hopeless. Maybe the president is right in that the Senate will determine the final outcome, but he is only right legally and technically. We can't support this any longer. We can be lied to only so many times. The best thing that he can do for the country is to get the hell out of the White House and get out this afternoon. Goldwater's well-tanned face was red. We've all been waiting to hear from Barry on this, said Senator Jacob K. Javits of New York. He made a moving statement. Everybody would be better off if the president resigned today. Goldwater was called out of the room to take a call from Haig. When he picked up the line, the operator said that General Haig was calling from the Oval Office. Goldwater heard a click on the line and guessed that the president was listening on an extension. Barry, Haig said, what is your gut feeling about what the Senate will do? Haig knew from Birch that Goldwater was in a message-sending mood. Goldwater was now convinced that the president was listening. This was his chance to get his message across forcefully. Al, Goldwater said angrily, the president has only 12 votes in the Senate. He has lied to me for the last time and lied to my colleagues for the last time. Back inside at the Republican policy lunch, the vice president was trying to cool off the group. Henry Kissinger made a fervent plea to hold firm because of foreign policy problems, Ford said. Regardless of Watergate, the cabinet as a whole, he said, should be undivided on foreign policy. He was not making a casual comment on this. He said this would be a very adverse time to show a lack of support for U.S. foreign policy or its implementation. Ford seemed almost shy about discussing what had happened. It is a frightening experience that all of this concern by Republicans is not having any impact at all on the White House, Senator Brock said. 74-year-old conservative Senator Norris Cotton offered the first concrete proposal. He was sitting one seat from Ford, and he turned to him. I have suffered through this along with everybody else, he said. We are all in an impossible position. We are potential jurors, and our positions are hardening even though we have not heard the evidence. For the welfare of this nation, however, all of this talking to each other is foolish. We should talk to the president and convey to him the danger of his position if the Senate holds a trial. We should send a special Senate delegation to see him, an uncommitted delegation. I sympathize with Barry. We sit here very quietly, and the president is going along in his own way and his own pace. We can't sit quietly any longer. When Norris Cotton started talking about not sitting quietly, things were serious. Gentlemen, said Ford, in light of this discussion, I really must leave the room. I can't stay any longer. It wouldn't be proper for me to remain. He left at 1:40 to a standing ovation. The senators continued their discussion. Wallace Bennett of Utah. In my opinion, his resignation is more damaging than a conviction. Dominic of Colorado. Does the president know how we feel? The list of potential charges against him is incredible. His case is insupportable. He ought to get out now and not be forced out by the Congress. Tower of Texas. We have not yet gone to the White House with any of this because right now there is too much filtering of information. We can't get through. Clifford P. Hansen of Wyoming. We must send a delegation to the White House. I suggest that Barry Goldwater, Jack Javits, and Bob Griffin transmit our personal thoughts to the president. Brock of Tennessee. The White House is currently doing a damage evaluation. Let Tom Koroligas or Bill Timmons know your feelings. Roth of Delaware. We ought to move today. Charles H. Percy of Illinois. I think we ought to ask ourselves if the country is moving as fast as this city is. Peoria says slow down a bit, don't jump the gun. Milton R. Young of North Dakota. If the Senate holds a trial, then the Republican Party goes down with it. Griffin of Michigan. I hope that what we are saying here today does not find its way into the Washington Post tomorrow morning. Bill Brock is right. The White House information is good and head counts have been taken. I spoke to Al Haig and to Tom Koroligas. Edward W. Brooke of Massachusetts. We must be realistic. The country and the party have been hurt. The two-party system is important. A Senate trial, which St. Clair says could take 6 months, would kill all important legislation now pending in Congress. This would be detrimental to the country. As for the president, what can he gain by going to trial in the Senate? If he chooses to go through the impeachment process, he will lose decisively. A delegation must be sent to see him and explain the options. If he doesn't resign now, serious harm will come to the country and the party. William L. Scott of Virginia. We are all shocked by recent events, but will we feel this way next week? I support the delegation idea, but we really ought to think about this for a few days. McClure of Idaho. I agree with Bob Griffin on the problem of leaks today. If you're going to talk to reporters, don't include me in any assessment of our mood. Don't curry favor with the press by revealing our comments to them. The White House must get an accurate account of this meeting. The leadership can go down there, but Barry Goldwater is the one blunt enough to do the job. Charles M. Mathias, Jr. of Maryland. Norris Cotton's suggestion is good in terms of what the White House should know. We must convey our feelings directly to the president. The question is how. It must be an impressive demonstration. Cotton of New Hampshire. If the country gets the idea that we are prejudging this thing, we are in trouble. We must keep an open mind. Mathias, I agree. The House has not yet voted. Peter V. Domenici of New Mexico. Our leadership should go to the White House. So we will end this session right here. We're in the middle of Tuesday, August 6th, 1974. In The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Thanks for watching.